So this idea, right? Debt is money, right? I talk about it in the chapter as, it is not now a cliche, right? And I imagine in the future it will become a cliche, but it's not a cliche now, is it? Right? The idea of public debt being some sort of liability is much more common, right? Public debt being as liability versus being as yet another form of money, and perhaps the most powerful form of money imaginable, right? And the reason why I say this is, like if if you are a nation state, especially one that is considered rightly or wrongly, right? Because keep in mind how much of this is perceptual. So much of this book, right? If you notice, like even here, like he see like where is Anatoly, right? You know earlier on that he lives in a house or whatever, right? And that he's a day trader and whatnot. But in a lot of the chapters, right, I'm trying to keep the physicality as limited as possible. It's almost as if he's this kind of disembodied entity existing somewhere, right? There happen to be some paper charts. There happens to be a glass, and there happens to be ice, right? But beyond that, everything is just kind of like almost mental, right? I do have some of the action here taking place in this more advanced metaverse, right? We see the metaverse in the news now. It does seem like all those corporate backed metaverses, like with a Facebook or whatever else, they probably aren't really gonna go anywhere. Maybe they'll be adopted in certain business settings or whatever. But at the same time, right, you have the corporatist metaverses being built. You also have a ton of like open source metaverses being built, a ton of decentralized open kind of like entities being built, decentralized and permissionless in the sense that this thing exists. Developers elsewhere, not connected to the project in any kind of explicit way, not getting paid for it, whatever, could build on top of it, right? And I think this is probably where people would ultimately go, and there's going to be this odd mix, right? This tension between the corporatist metaverses and this sort of thing, right? Which will obviously along the way it'll constantly be sort of co-opted, right? It'll be parts of it will be nixed, right? Parts of it will be needled, right? But I'm sort of trying to make this idea, right, of everything kind of like existing a little bit in the abstract, right? So anyway, this idea of debt being money, right? In the world today, right, we still have this fear of public debt when in fact, if you are a nation state and you're the one that writes the rules, right? You're the one that sets the tone. You're the one that sets perceptions as to whether or not you are credit worthy, right? Because again, this is a perceptual game. You should be being the one who prints the money and the one that passes the laws. You could do essentially whatever you want with this money, right? I mean, if Democrats if they find Jesus right now and they decide to push through, a $10 trillion spending package, right? Federal job guarantee, light rail connecting all 50 states, high speed rail connected all 50 states, universal health coverage, and all these other goodies that will pay economic multipliers, right? I mean, if you start doing this kind of thing, it's actually in the long term, it's very good for people, partly because, any like if you imagine this a ledger of public debt versus public surplus, anytime that a country shifts to surplus, like during the 90s under Bill Clinton, every single time that America has shifted to a surplus and has paid off the national debt, within a year, maybe 2 3 years at most, what ends up happening every single time is you enter either a pretty steep recession or a depression, right? We saw that immediately, right, after Bill Clinton had a stimulus. Or a lot of people might want to blame, we had the tech bubble burst, and we had, we had the September 11th attacks, but none of that would really matter all that much if public spending ends up putting money in the pockets of everyday people, right? Because this is ultimately what matters the most. Like when people are like crying about like, are we in a recession? Are we not in a recession? I mean, one way to obviate these kinds of conversations is if you spend more and therefore people have more money to spend, you will not enter into a recession. And like the word recession is kind of funny, right? Because you often think like, well, who exactly do you mean when you say recession, right? Because there's plenty of people in America right now that like since the 90s, they've been in a kind of de facto recession. If you're anywhere in the world where NAFTA has created, for example, a fentanyl problem, and since the 90s, white male lifespans have been going down, mortality has been going up. You've been in a recession for a long time. Even if, let's say Walmart came into your city, took all the jobs, everybody that was a business owner is now working, for much less money in these corporations. If this is what transpired for you, when you look at the overall metrics, right, you could sort of make the argument that Walmart is more efficient, right? It adds more to GDP, that sort of thing. But it doesn't actually matter if what these individual medians feel is, my income has been cut in half. My sense of dignity has been cut in half. Everybody around me is developing these long-term deadly addictions, right? GDP means nothing to you. Whether or not there's a macro recession or not means nothing to you. You are, for all intents and purposes, in a recession. So what I believe over time is as things become more and more drastic, this idea of debt as money, right? It's going to become trite, right? It's going to be just something that people understand, right? I mean, even now, I think you could as austere as the Obama administration was, right? As austere as the Biden administration is shaping up to be, I don't think, we're heading back to the pre sort of 2009 environment of austerity, right? Not that kind of austerity. It seems like we're always going to have now, some sort of baseline of spending that we're probably not going to dip under, right? It's not going to be used in the right places. It's not going to be sufficient ever. I'm saying debt is money and other value neutrals a little bit ironically, right? Because even this concept of debt being money, it's not necessarily value neutral, right? Because although technically it could be, you could sort of use debt for whatever purposes that you like, there is almost a natural implication, or a natural set of oughts if you embrace the idea that debt is money and all you have to do is to create a multiplier effect, right? Because when you look at the kind of things that create multiplier effects, they happen to be spending for the public good, right? It naturally starts to fit itself a little better with a kind of a leftist ideology. This hits me, right? That a rich man, right? It's this it was some real estate developer. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he gets concerned for whatever reason, reading too much economic fiction, let's call it, right? And he's getting so concerned about the debt, and he has so much power, he has so much money, and he has absolutely nothing to do with this fucking time, right? So he starts to insinuate himself in places where he doesn't belong. Why did Bill Gates, after founding Microsoft, why did he decide to insinuate himself in vaccination? Why did he decide to insinuate himself in American education by, pushing forward all of this, a charter school crap, right? There's no reason for you to do that other than total fucking boredom. There's no reason other than I made a bunch of money. I therefore have all these assumptions about what I do and don't know about life, and I'm gonna force that down. I'm gonna cram it down people's throats, right? And why do people have these the richer the person is? Why do they have these progressively more and more insane kind of suppositions, right? It's kind of odd, right? Where libertarian types say, the more that you are in tune with reality, the more money that you could make, right? Because the reality gives you this feedback and this is the response. But it seems to me that the richer that you get, the more kind of cordon off you are from the rest of the world, the less you understand that world, and that more that you need, right? You need this fucking white noise to help you sleep, right? Because if you don't have that white noise, of course, as someone that is too rich and too powerful for your own good, all you have in your head is just trash that's going to keep you from sleeping, right? So they're always looking for that white noise. Death of hundreds of millions. Maybe this is in reference to climate change. Maybe it's in reference to this kind of great pandemic. Eventually, we're going to get something that I think, right, where all these people that are so fat and sassy off of COVID, right? Because as bad as COVID is, it's not the worst thing imaginable. Right, you'll have long-term disabilities. You have tens of millions of people that will not be accommodated for by either party. You'll have long-term drags in the economy because of this. And in terms of deaths, you will have probably millions ultimately that die from COVID. But you could imagine something that's 10 times worse, 10 times as infectious, 10 times as prone to creating cripples out of the people that do survive, right? And now, with COVID, I see people who are kind of, very sassy about it simply because most likely they won't die from it, right? And maybe they won't even be disabled from it. So they get kind of sassy. But once we get like a pandemic that does 10 times the numbers or whatever and leaves 10 times as many cripples, all this like libertarian fucking shit about like, I'm going to go on YouTube and I'm going to like make some dumbass video about, why you shouldn't be vaccinated, or this is all about government control, right? They're going to take rights away from you, blah, blah, blah. I think that is going to go away really quickly, right? Because you see some people that are like conceptually against, vax mandates, right, in every category, but that conceptually they're not truly against it, because you can imagine situations where they would absolutely demand not only vaccines for themselves, but demand that everybody else gets vaccines as well, right? Like imagine something that has like 100x the fatality rate of COVID, right? Even if you are vaccinated, let's say it has 25x the rate of crippling you, right? You're going to be like, like fuck that, like everybody needs to be vaccinated and I need to be vaccinated. And if you're not getting vaccinated, I'm going to fucking kill you, right? So I imagine a situation where, something's going to happen where this trajectory that we've been on, where government continues to cede power, right, to private cartels. I can imagine them disappearing. I can imagine that going away, right? Eventually, you're going to say enough is enough. My fear is, even when we get to that point, we'll still be on the precipice, and some people will still be arguing, right? The terms of the debate will be different. What they will get out of those debates will be different. But I imagine we will have to be on some kind of precipice before that occurs. Right. And this is kind of the happy moment, right? The debt line finally shoots up, right? And now it looks like the parabolas, when I say parabolas of his own day, right? What I am sort of, and a lot of this is just kind of by implication, right? One thing that I dislike strongly, and also I think is a true artistic liability for sci-fi is, tons of sci-fi tries to like spell everything out to you, right? What I'm sort of implying here, why this guy's a traitor and why he would have traders like visiting his home or whatever. I allude to this later on, right? There was a chapter earlier on where he gets into this like argument, with a trader, right? Because of, he took the opposite end of a trade. There's like these gas wars going on and, this guy's upset. So he shows up. But when I say parables of his own day, like I'm sort of making the implication, and this is going to be a little more clear elsewhere, that so much of this world is gamified. You kind of have to, right? If you have scarce resources, scarce land, everybody's living in these huge, huge high rises. You sort of have to gamify human experience to extract as much yield as possible from it, right? If there's any kind of a premium, whether you pay a cryptocurrency premium, decentralization, permissionless structures, whatever, there's a premium on those because there's a functionality to those, but also, right, we have other possibilities of like how can you earn yield off of people, off of the backs of people, right? There's always this thing in the background of like people are yield, people are cash cows, people are animals to be milked, right? So the implication is tons of parabolas in his own day. People are constantly, jumping in and out of these like de facto casinos as they search for some kind of in between that is not just speculation. They're looking for a utility. They're looking for a baseline. They're looking for these new markets to build some sort of fundamental foundation, right? For it to finally make some kind of sense as the world progressively gets this kind of gamification. And this part too, right? So Canada, right? Canada is going to compete with Russia, but I think the funny part here is how like, of the two of them, like Canada, like it's kind of like America in the regard that what values does America have? What values is it arguing for right now? I don't really see that, right? Whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, those values aren't being fought for. Those values aren't becoming, what needs to be in a sense, right? And Russia though, like historically, it hasn't been honest about its values, right? It hasn't been honest about the means by which it would attain those values, right? You were supposed to have a Marxist-Leninist state in which the state apparatus withers away, right? This is supposed to be the Marxist position, but that didn't happen, right? All you had was You had the death of millions, and even if that process, let's call it another process of capitalization, even if it might have prevented something even worse from happening, the extent to which Russia wants to be like the spiritual successor to the Roman Empire, it needs to not be honest about the means by which this occurs, right? And it would be kind of funny and ironic if this happens by happenstance. But again, like I said earlier, if this does happen by happenstance, to what extent did things just kind of go through a self-fulfilling prophecy? Or like Russia is a state that's on the decline, right? It's going to have a population decline. Right now, the fact that it's a petro state, right? That's going to have to that's going to damage it in the long term, right? It's going to need other sources of value, right? Probably land is going to be what's going to happen, and just kind of like the idea that there's places for people to live, there's stability, there's climate stability there, but because of its size, because it has so much land, because we don't seem to be getting off of oil anytime soon, like Obama was thought to be like good for the environment, but I think when the history books get written on that, I think his administration will be seen as one of the worst administrations for the environment, even with something like the Paris Accords or whatever, because he made the price of oil, the price of natural gas, also just much cheaper. Now, if all these factors, right, whether it's a kind of self-perception, right, perception as a kind of gamification, these like a metaverse kind of future, right? If these kinds of perceptions end up taking reality by the horns and turning perceptions into reality by the force of just like holding on to that bull, right, and not letting go, right, to the extent that Russia is comfortable with its massive sort of set of lands, right, to the extent that the former Soviet satellites, right, are willing to be under the thumb of Russia a little bit. And to the extent that they're going to have to be, right, as many of those places, over the century are probably going to desertify a little bit, right? I'm calling it the Omsk equilibrium, but I am kind of flirting with some of those kinds of Siberian cities, right? Have a chapter where a bunch of these kind of like natives from Siberia, like people that you never hear about, right? I feel like some of these groups are kind of like visible, only if you kind of like look them up, but I can imagine natives sort of kind of like, being around there, being kind of like de facto, finally inheritors of the earth, right? And they're ratifying this wide treaty, right? Maybe I'm going to change Omsk into one of these city names, but Omsk just sounds, I think, much better than some of these city names. But I'll find like some way to finesse out a little bit, maybe, right? So Russia, you could imagine, right, with all this kind of context. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe that's sufficient, right? Maybe all these people in Russia, decade after decade, maybe they all are rational actors, right? In ways that even they themselves don't see. They're being pushed along, right? If everything is a price chart, if everything goes to euphoria and depression, maybe they're perfectly okay just existing at these long-term support levels, accumulation zones, as the beast, right, the Russian beast fucking dips down into that river, drinks, and eventually comes up, right? Maybe it knew, consciously or not, what it was doing all along, right? Another idea that I want to flirt with. But, there's a reason why it looks like this. Like, people are, whether or not it's coming on their terms, on their timeline, right? It's irrelevant, right? They are expecting an inflationary environment. But I mean, looking at this chart, looking at the long-term behavior of gold, I mean, just look at this from 1980 to the 2000s, right? None of this, right, with all the spending, just gradually spending is ratcheting it up, right? Even if it's not going in the right places. This does not look, especially here, this does not look like a hyperinflationary environment to me, right? Because that's another thing that the gold bugs do. Right? And Bitcoin people especially, right? They talk about a hyperinflationary environment. This doesn't look like it to me, right? This looks like here we are, we had these highs from like a decade ago, and we're not even at the highs right now. So like if we have, inflation being, at these kinds of peaks, let's call it, isn't it kind of sad that gold, which is supposed to be an inflation hedge, is worth less now than at the peak 10 years ago, right? 11 years ago. Because 11 years ago, we, we've had obviously even if it's sub 2% inflation, a couple things happened. We had a doubling of the money supply pre-COVID, so that occurred. But if you had a doubling of the money supply, if the assumption that people were working with was essentially like, oh look, double the money supply, we need to therefore have like double the inflation. Well, you were sorely mistaken about that, weren't you? Right? You need to adjust how you think about these things, but no one adjusted. And so here we are in this new inflationary environment, and yet we're it's uncertain, isn't it? We broke the all-time highs here. We had a bunch of closes here, right? This is the weekly chart again. We had a bunch of closes here. This kind of like, okay, so we broke all-time high. Now we're going to consolidate here, and it's going to be going to fresh highs. But that didn't happen. We consolidate, then we have to dip in, right? We didn't dip into the channel yet. Consolidate, right? And look at this pathetic second attempt, right? Not only like this wick, right? This wasn't even on a close, but on the wick we had the all-time high. On this wick, you attempt to make a new all-time high. And that didn't happen, right? And didn't even hit that all-time high from 2020, right? So really a sort of pathetic attempt by gold. It seems to be now for the first time in a while, trying to dip down into this channel, right? The beast wants to drink, right? But even if the beast wants to drink for the next leg up, this doesn't seem like a chart that is bracing for hyperinflation. If gold is a multi-trillion-dollar asset class, then it has, let's say, these various use cases, and it has, it works as a hedge against inflation. It will also act as a liquidity sponge, which means B, also as an information sponge. And the information that it's sponging up, right? The information that maybe you're not privy to, I'm not privy to, the various analysts are not privy to. The information seems to me like, okay, we are gearing up ultimately for another leg up. We're not going to simply stop here, but we might have to dip into this channel. We might have to dip into the channel hard, right? We might have to chop around in this channel for a little bit under the channel. But we might have to keep taking that swig of water, right, to placate the beast, to quench that thirst before we move back up. So when I see a chart like this, right, and I try to imagine what Anatoly might think, right, as he's looking at all these historical charts, what I think of these charts extrapolating to the future, I see, an increase, as always, right, an increase in the inflationary environment, not in some sort of dramatic over-the-top way, right, that justifies, the kinds of like worst kind of instincts of these bag holders, but an inflationary environment that continues to sort of chop away, through these like little nicks, right? Just like bleeding them little by little. Like imagine just like a paper cut after paper cut, just bleeding you little by little, right, through inflation. But nobody's actually doing the kind of long-term spending that would like force you out of this mess, right? So because this is what's happening, I imagine the same kind of long-term moves that we've seen with gold, they're probably going to continue, right? And they're not going to continue due to hyperinflation. They will continue due to these like perceptual sort of differences, right? And they're going to continue simply because, this is the expectation. And I think this expectation is in one of these rare cases, right? I always say like go against the sentiment, but this is one of those expectations that will cohere with reality. Maybe not in the way that's described, right? Maybe not hyperinflation, but it's going to happen.